My sister shamed me at her wedding as a used product. Then the groom exposed her darkest secret. The air in the grand ballroom of the Omni Nashville Hotel was thick with the scent of white roses and simmering resentment. My sister, Vanessa, my own flesh and blood, stood on a raised platform, her white lace gown shimmering under the spotlights, a dazzling, deceptive smile plastered across her face. Beside her, our mother, Evelyn, clutched a microphone, her eyes, usually so cold, glinting with a malicious satisfaction that made my stomach clench. This was supposed to be a celebration, the pinnacle of Vanessa's carefully curated life. But for me, Isabel Monroe, a single mother doing her best to simply survive, it was rapidly becoming a public execution. I had known, with a chilling certainty, that this day would be difficult. I hadn't anticipated it would be the day I was systematically, brutally, and irrevocably stripped bare in front of every person who mattered and many who didn't. The clinking of champagne glasses, the murmur of polite conversation, the soft strains of a string quartet, all faded into a deafening roar in my ears the moment my mother's voice, amplified, cut through the genteel hum, and now. A special word from the bride and her mother, about family, she announced, her smile widening as she gestured to Vanessa. My sister took the mic, her eyes, usually narrowed in judgment when they landed on me, now gleamed with a false warmth as she scanned the room. I felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't just a toast. This felt orchestrated. I gripped the armrest of my gilded chair, my knuckles white. My son, Leo, bless his innocent 7-year-old heart, was nestled beside me, oblivious, engrossed in drawing knights and dragons on a napkin. I pulled him a fraction closer, a protective instinct, a primal fear, stirring within me. Vanessa cleared her throat, a delicate, almost theatrical sound. My dearest friends and family, she began, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. Today is the culmination of a dream of perfection, of finding my soulmate, of building a future untouched by imperfections. Her gaze, sharp as a shard of glass, found mine across the room. My breath hitched. Imperfections. She wasn't talking about the slightly crooked centerpiece on table 7. She was talking about me. Her voice, however, remained light, airy. You all know how much I value purity, flawlessness, a clean slate. My husband-to-be, David, embodies all of that. A ripple of appreciative murmurs went through the room. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a sermon, and I was the sinner on display. Then, Mother Evelyn took the microphone back, her expression shifting from benign matriarch to a viper ready to strike. Indeed, she purred, her eyes fixed on me, a predatory gleam in their depths. Every woman dreams of her wedding day. It's the day she presents herself, unblemished, to her chosen partner, a pristine, unopened gift. Not everyone is so fortunate. Of course, her words hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. A few heads turned towards me, discreetly at first, then more overtly. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a blush of shame and fury. Leo looked up, sensing the shift in my mood. "Mommy, are you okay?" he whispered, his small hand finding mine. I squeezed it, forcing a tremulous smile. "I'm fine, sweetie," I lied, my voice barely audible. The room, once alive with celebration, now held a suffocating silence, punctuated only by my mother's deliberate, cruel words. "Some women," she continued, her voice gaining strength, each word a carefully aimed dart, "make choices. Choices that leave them used like a product that's been returned. opened, its value diminished. And when that product comes with an addendum, a complication, a defective son, one can only pity the poor soul left to deal with the consequences. The laughter began as a ripple, a few nervous titters, then a wave, building into a crescendo that washed over me, drowning me in humiliation. It wasn't just a few people, it was dozens, hundreds, their faces a blur of cruel amusement. The sound was a physical assault, each peal of mirth a fresh stab to my chest. Used product, defective son. The words echoed in the cavernous space, amplified by the sound system, by the cruel joy on my sister's face, by the triumphant sneer on my mother's. My vision blurred, tears stinging my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. My son, Leo, my beautiful, brilliant, perfectly imperfect son, suddenly seemed smaller, more vulnerable beside me. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, confused by the strange sounds, the staring faces. He didn't understand. And that, more than anything, tore me apart. How could they speak of him like that? How could they reduce him and me to such callous labels? My entire body trembled. A raw, exposed nerve, the opulent decor, the glittering chandeliers, the perfectly arranged flowers. It all became a backdrop to my public undoing. I was a spectacle, an object of ridicule, in the very place where my sister was supposed to be celebrated. This wasn't just humiliation, it was an annihilation of my spirit, a deliberate dismantling of my already fragile self-worth. Every past slight, every cutting remark, every moment of feeling less than, flooded my mind, converging into this agonizing present. The air grew thin, the laughter a physical weight pressing down on me, crushing the breath from my lungs. I wanted to disappear, to vanish into the gilded walls, to simply cease to exist. I squeezed Leo's hand tighter, a silent promise to protect him from this venomous world, even as I failed spectacularly to protect myself. Just as the last echoes of their triumphant, mocking laughter began to fade, a figure rose from the head table. It was David, Vanessa's new husband. He was a tall man, quiet and unassuming, with kind eyes I'd always found a stark contrast to Vanessa's sharp edges. My mother and sister, still basking in their victory, didn't seem to notice him at first. Then, a hush began to fall, starting from the tables closest to the head table, spreading outwards like a silent wave. My head snapped up, my gaze locking onto him. He held his hand up, not in a celebratory wave, but in a gesture that commanded attention. The last vestiges of laughter died away, replaced by an expectant, bewildered silence. My mother's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, a frown creasing her brow. David looked directly at me, his gaze steady, unwavering, and then he began to speak. And in that moment, as his voice, calm and clear, filled the room, a truth, long buried and unthinkable, began to unravel. My heart still throbbed a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but the sheer shock of David, the quiet groom, rising and speaking, had momentarily frozen the chaos within me. My mother's irritated frown deepened, her eyes flicking from David to me with a venomous curiosity. Vanessa, usually so composed, looked utterly bewildered, her perfect bride mask cracking. I could see the questions forming in her mind. What is he doing? Why is he interrupting our moment? It was as if their carefully constructed facade of familial harmony, built on my silent suffering, was suddenly under siege. My earliest memories were steeped in this pervasive sense of being less than in my own family, a ghost haunting the vibrant lives of my mother and sister. Evelyn, my mother, had always been a woman obsessed with appearances, with the polished veneer of success and social standing. She had grown up in a respectable, though not wealthy, family in a small town in Tennessee, and every decision she made, every breath she took, seemed aimed at elevating her perceived status. Vanessa, 5 years my senior, was her masterpiece, a reflection of everything Evelyn aspired to be: beautiful, poised, effortlessly popular. Vanessa glided through life, seemingly blessed with an innate ability to charm and succeed. My mother fostered this image, often praising Vanessa's accomplishments loudly while offering my own quieter successes with a dismissive shrug. "Isabel is different," she'd often say to relatives, a subtle sigh accompanying the words, as if my very existence was a minor inconvenience, a blot on her perfect family canvas. This constant, subtle shaming had been the background hum of my childhood. I learned early on that my value was tied to how little trouble I caused, how invisible I could be. My efforts to gain her approval were met with lukewarm acknowledgement at best, and often with thinly veiled criticism. It created a chasm between us, a lonely space where I felt perpetually misunderstood and unloved. Sibling rivalry is a common phenomenon, often fueled by a quest for parental attention, and, in our case, it was magnified by my mother's blatant favoritism. Vanessa thrived on it. From a young age, she reveled in her role as the golden child, and I, the quiet, artistic one, became her natural foil. My interests were dismissed as eccentric, my dreams as impractical. When I wanted to study literature, my mother scoffed. "And how will that pay the bills, Isabel?" "Look at Vanessa, already interning at a reputable law firm." Vanessa would smirk, a silent co-conspirator in my mother's subtle put-downs. The constant comparison was a slow erosion of my self-worth. It chipped away at my confidence, leaving me with a perpetual sense of inadequacy. My childhood was a carefully choreographed dance around Vanessa's brilliance, with me always in the shadows, waiting for a misstep, a moment where I might finally shine. That moment never came. The psychological impact of being shamed by a parent can be profound, leading to self-doubt, anxiety, and depression in adulthood. It wasn't just individual instances, it was a consistent pattern of emotional abuse that made me feel flawed and inadequate. Then came Leo. His father, Mark, had been a whirlwind romance, a passionate but ultimately fleeting connection during my college years. He was a free spirit, much like me, drawn to art and music, but completely unsuited for the responsibilities of fatherhood. When I discovered I was pregnant, Mark, true to his nature, vanished. I made the difficult decision to keep Leo, a choice that brought a tidal wave of condemnation from my family. "How could you be so irresponsible, Isabel?" my mother had wailed, her voice laced with disgust. "You've ruined your life, and ours." "What will people say?" Vanessa, ever the pragmatist, declared me naive and reckless. There was no offer of support, no embrace of the new life growing within me, only judgment. The shame I had carried since childhood intensified, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate me. My family's reaction reinforced their narrative that I was fundamentally flawed, a constant disappointment. They saw Leo not as a miracle, but as further proof of my imperfections. The concept of shame-based families, where parents transfer their shame onto their children, resonated deeply with my experience. My mother, in particular, used shaming as a parenting tool. Puncturing my self-esteem and deteriorating our relationship, I moved out of my childhood home shortly after Leo was born, seeking refuge in a small, quiet apartment in Nashville, far enough to breathe, but close enough that their venom could still reach me during holiday gatherings or obligatory phone calls. I worked tirelessly, juggling 2 part-time jobs while Leo was in daycare, then found a full-time position as an editorial assistant for a small publishing house. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it provided for Leo. He was my world, My light, the beautiful, vibrant antidote to all the darkness my family had inflicted. He was bright, inquisitive, and possessed a mischievous twinkle in his eyes that always made me smile. He also had a speech impediment, a slight lisp that made certain words a delightful challenge for him. It was minor, something speech therapy was helping with. But to my mother and Vanessa, it was further proof of his defects, a tangible representation of my failure. They saw it as an extension of my own perceived flaws, a continuation of the imperfection Vanessa had so cruelly alluded to in her speech. Their cruelty about Leo felt like a violation, a sacrilege against the most precious part of my life. Despite the emotional abuse and the estrangement that had grown over the years, a common outcome in families with long-standing issues like emotional abuse and unrealistic expectations, I always felt a pull to maintain some semblance of family connection, particularly for Leo. I wanted him to know his grandparents, his aunt, even if those relationships were often fraught with tension. I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that with time, my mother and Vanessa would soften at him, that they would see Leo for the joy he was, and perhaps even extend a sliver of acceptance to me. I clung to the idea that blood was thicker than water, even if that blood felt poisoned. This hope, this desperate yearning for their approval, was what always brought me back, like a moth to a toxic flame. Each family gathering was a fresh wound, a new opportunity for them to highlight my shortcomings and reinforce their own sense of superiority. The wedding, however, had crossed a line. Their words, used product and defective son, were not just insults, they were an attempt to invalidate my entire existence, to dehumanize Leo. The air in the ballroom still crackled with the aftermath of their words, the stunned silence broken only by the sharp intake of breath from David as he began to speak. He stood tall, his gaze sweeping the room, then settling on me, a strange mix of sorrow and determination in his eyes. David cleared his throat, a soft sound that nevertheless resonated in the sudden, profound silence of the ballroom. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, measured, almost impossibly gentle given the venom that had just been spewed. "Thank you. Evelyn," he began, his eyes meeting my mother's, who was now staring at him with a mixture of annoyance and dawning confusion. "And Vanessa, my love for your candid remarks." The way he paused, just slightly, on candid, sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't the innocent interruption I had briefly hoped for. This was something else entirely. My sister, still caught in the afterglow of her cruel performance, seemed to finally register the gravity of his tone, her perfectly manicured hand, clutching a bouquet of white roses, lowered slowly. "Family," David continued, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests, then returning to rest on me, a deep, unsettling sorrow in their depths, "is a complex tapestry, woven with threads of love. Yes, but sometimes, sadly, also with threads of deceit, and the bitter tang of regret." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. This was not the typical groom's toast. This was a confession. My mother's face, which had been frozen in a triumphant smirk, began to contort into a mask of pure disbelief, then horror. Vanessa's jaw dropped, her eyes wide with a sudden, dawning terror. It was a delicious moment of reversal, watching their smug certainty crumble. But it was quickly overshadowed by a rising tide of dread in my own chest. What truth could David, this quiet, seemingly unassuming man, possibly reveal that would shake them so profoundly? What new betrayal awaited me? "Vanessa spoke of perfection," David said, his voice now imbued with an undeniable steel, "and Evelyn of a pristine, unopened gift. These are interesting metaphors for a marriage, especially when the gift has, in fact, Been opened before, and not just opened, but deliberately rewrapped to appear new. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, thick and suffocating. My mother gasped, a sharp, choked sound. Vanessa's face went chalk white, her eyes darting frantically towards the exit. The collective gasps from the guests were like a physical wave, washing over the room. The silence that followed was absolute, a void where only David's steady voice existed. "I believe in honesty," he continued, his gaze unwavering as he looked directly at Vanessa. "In truth. And while my future wife and I have discussed at length the complexities of our pasts, there is one particular complexity that has been willfully, maliciously hidden from me by my fiancé, hidden from me by my future mother-in-law, and hidden from me, until very recently, by Isabel." My breath hitched. Hidden by me. What was he talking about? A fresh wave of panic seized me. Had they somehow twisted something from my past, something innocent, into a weapon against me, and now David was unwittingly revealing it? My mind raced, frantically searching for a hidden secret that could possibly connect me to Vanessa's opened gift. David took a deep breath, his voice softening, yet gaining an undeniable weight. As many of you know, I met Vanessa at a charity gala almost 2 years ago. We connected instantly. Or so I believed. She presented herself as a woman of impeccable background, of unwavering morals, of a life lived without complications. His eyes flickered to my mother, a chilling accusation in their depths. What I didn't know, what was actively concealed from me, was the existence of a child, a son. The murmurs in the room exploded into a cacophony of whispers. Vanessa let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure anguish. My mother, Evelyn, looked like she was about to faint, her hand gripping the microphone stand for support. "A son?" David repeated, his voice now filled with a raw, agonizing pain. "A beautiful little boy named Thomas, born 9 years ago." My world tilted on its axis. Thomas, 9 years ago. That wasn't possible, like I didn't know anyone named Thomas. Then, with a sickening lurch, a memory, long suppressed and buried under layers of family lums, clawed its way to the surface. Vanessa. That summer she spent away, supposedly studying abroad. The frantic phone calls, the hushed conversations between her and mother, the sudden return, thin and pale, with a story about a bout of food poisoning. My mother's insistence that I never ask questions. The pieces, so disparate for so long, began to click into a horrifying, undeniable mosaic. David's voice, though still calm, now carried the heavy weight of profound betrayal. Thomas is not only my son, but he is also Vanessa's son. His words were a cannon blast, obliterating any semblance of order or propriety in the ballroom. The room erupted, gasps, exclamations, shocked whispers, and then, slowly, a rising tide of furious indignation. My mother stumbled backward, collapsing into a chair, her face a mask of crumpled defeat. Vanessa, her elaborate bridal veil askew, looked like a trapped animal, her eyes wide with terror, scanning the crowd for an escape. The new betrayal was not mine, but Vanessa's, and by extension, my mother's. But how did I fit into this, if it was hidden from me too? My mind reeled. The shock of the revelation was immense. But then came the cold, hard anger. Anger that they had done this, anger that they had lived with this secret, and anger at how they had used my own struggles, my own motherhood, to mask their profound deceit. David continued, his voice now a steady, unwavering force in the chaotic room. I learned about Thomas only a month ago. Not from Vanessa, not from Evelyn, but from Isabel. His eyes, filled with a complex blend of apology and gratitude, found mine. Isabel, who, in her quiet integrity, could not bear to see such a fundamental truth kept from me. Her sister's future husband, Isabel, who knew the pain of a child growing up without a father, and who, despite her family's cruel treatment, chose to act with compassion and honesty. A wave of heat flooded my face. Not shame, but a furious, righteous indignation. They had framed my past, my son, as defective, while concealing a much greater, much more morally repugnant secret of their own. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. David's words, though exonerating, also pulled me further into the maelstrom of their lies, exposing my complicity in the revelation. I felt utterly exposed, not just by my family's cruelty, but now, by David's revelation of my role. My stomach churned. The relief that it wasn't some unknown past of mine that was being exposed was quickly replaced by the terrifying realization that I was now at the epicenter of this implosion, a target for their inevitable, furious backlash. Vanessa finally found her voice, a raw, guttural scream. Isabel, You traitor! How could you? Her eyes blazed with a murderous fury that made me recoil. My mother, recovering from her initial shock, began to stir, her eyes narrowing on me with an even deeper, more profound hatred than before. David, however, stepped forward, placing a hand on Vanessa's arm. Don't you dare. Vanessa, this is not Isabel's fault. This is your fault. And yours. Evelyn. He turned to my mother, his voice cold as ice. You orchestrated this deception. You allowed your daughter to lie to me, to build a future on a foundation of falsehoods. And all the while, you publicly shamed the one person who had the courage to tell me the truth. The guests were now a frenzied blur of whispers and shocked faces, their polite composure utterly shattered. They pointed, they gestured, their eyes wide with scandal. My entire body trembled, not from cold, but from the raw surge of adrenaline, of a fight-or-flight response overriding everything else. Leo, disturbed by the sudden uproar, buried his face in my side, whimpering, "Mommy!" "What's happening?" he cried, his voice muffled against my dress. I wrapped my arm around him, pulling him tighter. My gaze locked on the escalating drama at the head table. The humiliation I had felt just moments before was still a dull ache, but it was now overshadowed by a terrifying sense of chaos and a desperate need to protect my son from the fallout of this public spectacle. My emotional discomfort deepened, twisting from personal shame to a communal horror, with me caught right in the middle. The wedding, once a symbol of their triumph, had become a public arena of their downfall, and I, unwillingly, was the catalyst. The chaos in the grand ballroom was absolute. The murmurs had crescendoed into a roar of disbelief, punctuated by gasps and agitated exclamations. It was no longer a wedding, it was a sensational public spectacle, a brutal unmasking played out for hundreds of horrified guests. Vanessa's scream, shrill and laced with venom, cut through the din. Isabel, you traitor. How could you, her face, moments ago radiating bridal bliss, was now contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, a grotesque caricature of her usual poised self. Her eyes, narrowed to slits, pierced me with a hatred so profound it felt like a physical blow. My mother, Evelyn, initially stunned into silence, rallied quickly, her features hardening into that familiar, terrifying mask of calculated fury. She rose from her chair, abandoning the microphone, and stalked towards me, her designer gown rustling ominously. Leo, clinging to my side, began to sob. "Mommy, I'm scared," he wailed, burying his face deeper into my hip. His small body trembled, and the sound of his distress was like a sharp knife twisting in my gut. My immediate, visceral instinct was to shield him, to scoop him up and run, to somehow make this nightmare disappear. The humiliation I had felt earlier, the raw shame of being called a used product, and having my son labeled defective had been a crushing weight. But now, as their furious accusations turned on me, as the room became a maelstrom of judgment and scandal, that shame began to transmute into something cold and hard, a fierce, protective resolve. "You knew," Evelyn hissed, her voice low but piercing, her eyes alight with a dangerous gleam. She was inches from me now, her manicured fingers clenched into fists. "You destroyed everything our family." Vanessa's happiness, her words, dripping with outrage, were a bizarre perversion of the truth. They had destroyed everything. With their lies, their cruelty, their relentless shaming. They had built a kingdom on a foundation of sand, and now it was collapsing, not because of me, but because of their own rotten core. David stepped between us, his posture firm. "Evelyn, stop." Isabel did nothing wrong. She merely spoke the truth, a truth you both deliberately withheld. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the escalating hysteria around him, but it held an undeniable authority. "Vanessa, think about what you've done, Yito. You lied to me for 2 years. You let me believe you were someone you weren't." Vanessa recoiled, her eyes darting nervously towards the guests, who were now openly staring, whispering, some even pulling out their phones. The veneer of her perfect life had shattered, revealing the ugly truth beneath. My mind raced back, through the haze of the last month, to the day the truth about Thomas had emerged. It had been a chance encounter, a bizarre twist of fate. I had been volunteering at a local charity event, helping set up a silent auction, when I overheard a conversation between 2 older women, gossiping about the Monroe family. They spoke of a secret that Evelyn had been desperate to bury a child, born out of wedlock, given up for adoption years ago. They mentioned vague details: a summer Vanessa spent away, a young man from her past, and a boy named Thomas, who had recently been trying to connect with his birth mother. At first, I dismissed it as baseless rumor. My mother was a master of secrets, but this seemed too sensational, even for her. Then, a week later, an email landed in my inbox. It was from a private investigator hired by an adoption agency, seeking information about Vanessa Monroe. Attached was a photo of a mom, perhaps 9 years old, with dark hair and striking blue eyes that seemed eerily familiar. The name under the photo was Thomas Hayes. My heart had plummeted. The blue eyes, they were David's eyes that he had mentioned, casually one day. That his family had a rare genetic trait of deep blue eyes. A cold dread had settled in my stomach. The investigator's email confirmed that Thomas was looking for his birth mother, Vanessa Monroe, and it confirmed that his birth father was David Hayes. The realization had hit me like a physical blow. Vanessa had given birth to David's child years before they met, and both she and my mother had actively concealed it. The implications were staggering. Vanessa, the epitome of purity and perfection in my mother's eyes, had a secret child. A child with the very man she was about to marry, and this was the family who had shamed me for being a single mother, for daring to raise Leo, for being used and defective. The hypocrisy was so monumental, so utterly grotesque, that I felt a dizzying sense of unreality. I had wrestled with the information for days. My first instinct was to ignore it. This was their mess, not mine. They had caused me enough pain. Why should I involve myself? Especially when revealing it would surely bring down a fresh wave of their wrath. But then I thought of David. He seemed genuinely kind. A decent man, albeit one who was clearly oblivious to the deep rot within the family he was marrying into. And I thought of Thomas, a child who deserved to know his father more powerfully. I thought of Leo, my beautiful, innocent Leo, whose father had abandoned him and whose identity was known only to me. How could I, knowing the pain of a child growing up without a father, allow another child to be kept from his, especially when the truth was so readily available. The decision had been agonizing, weighing my own safety and peace against the imperative of truth and a child's right to his identity. But ultimately, my sense of justice, honed by years of enduring their lies and slights, had won out. I couldn't stand by and watch them perpetuate such a colossal fraud, especially when it involved an innocent child and a good man. I had found David's contact information through a mutual acquaintance and sent him an anonymous email, directing him to the adoption agency and subtly hinting at a secret his fiancée was keeping. I had provided just enough information to point him in the right direction, letting him uncover the full truth himself. I had expected the fallout. I had expected their fury. But I hadn't anticipated it would happen here, at the wedding. So spectacularly, so utterly, in front of everyone. Back in the ballroom, the noise reached a fever pitch. Guests were openly shouting, some demanding explanations, others expressing disgust. Vanessa was sobbing now, her perfect makeup streaking her cheeks. My mother, Evelyn, had abandoned her attack on me, turning instead to David, pleading with him, trying to salvage some shred of dignity. David, please. It's a misunderstanding. Isabel is just jealous. She's always been unstable, the words, flung at me like poisoned darts, seemed to bounce off a newly erected shield, as Leo's frightened whimpers continued against my side. A profound shift occurred within me. I looked at Evelyn, at the desperate, contorted face of my mother, the woman who had spent my entire life trying to diminish me, to make me feel small and unworthy. And then I looked at Vanessa, crumpled and broken, exposed for the fraud she was. For years, I had craved their approval, longed for their love, believed their narrative that I was somehow less. But seeing them now, stripped bare of their pretense, their cruelty laid open for the world to see, I realized with startling clarity that they were the defective ones. Not me, not Leo. A deep calm settled over me, a stillness in the eye of the storm. The crushing weight of humiliation lifted, replaced by a liberating sense of clarity and unshakable resolve. I had nothing left to lose. They had taken everything they could, my confidence, my peace, my family connection, but they had failed to take my integrity, my compassion, or my son's beautiful spirit, my knees, which had been trembling uncontrollably, suddenly felt steady beneath me. My spine straightened. My gaze, which had been downcast, met Evelyn's, then Vanessa's. There was no anger left in me, only a profound, almost peaceful, sense of detachment. They had tried to break me, but in their moment of triumph, they had inadvertently forged me anew. I was no longer a victim. I was the one who had quietly, decisively set the truth free, and that truth, their truth, was far more damaging than any lie they could ever invent about me. This was my turning point. The public spectacle, their downfall, was not my collapse, but my silent, internal liberation. The ballroom was a tempest. The genteel clinking of glasses had been replaced by the roar of scandalized whispers, the rustle of expensive fabrics by the frantic movements of guests craning their necks, openly pointing. Vanessa, her face a tear-streaked ruin, stumbled backward from David, her earlier fury dissolving into a desperate, panicked whimper. "No, David. No, it's not true. It's a lie." Isabel made it up. Her voice cracked, barely audible over the din, but the desperate denial was clear. My mother, Evelyn, ever the pragmatist, even in the face of utter ruin, lunged forward, clutching at David's arm. "Darling, please. You must listen to me. This is Isabel's twisted fantasy. She's always been unstable, a pathological liar." Leo, still buried against my side, began to shake violently. The sheer volume of the uproar, the raw emotion emanating from the head table. was terrifying for a 7-year-old. My protective instincts surged, overriding every other thought. I tightened my arm around him, pulling him even closer, my body instinctively shielding his small frame. My gaze, however, remained fixed on the unfolding drama at the altar. David pulled his arm free from Evelyn's grasp, his expression one of profound disappointment, not anger. Evelyn. The adoption agency confirmed it. The DNA test confirmed it. Thomas is my son, and Vanessa's. There is no lie here, only the truth you so desperately tried to bury. His words, delivered with a quiet, undeniable finality, were like hammers striking glass. The last fragile remnants of Evelyn and Vanessa's carefully constructed world shattered. Vanessa let out a guttural scream, a primal sound of despair and rage. "You did this! Isabel, you ruined my life!" She lunged towards me, her hands outstretched, claws ready to tear. But before she could reach me, David was there, intercepting her. He held her at arm's length, his eyes filled with a weary sorrow. "Vanessa, stop. This is your doing, not Isabel's. Your choices, your lies." My mother, her face blotchy and contorted with a venomous rage, turned her fury back on me. "You little viper, you've always been jealous, always trying to drag us down to your pathetic level. This is your revenge, isn't it, for every success Vanessa ever had, for every moment you felt less than her words, meant to wound, now felt strangely hollow. The shield I had silently erected felt impenetrable." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the formidable matriarch who had controlled my life for so long, but a desperate, broken woman, unraveling before my very eyes. Her accusations, once so potent, now held no power over me. "No. Mother," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the din. It was the first time I had spoken since David began his revelation. And my voice, though quiet, seemed to carry an unexpected authority. A hush fell over the immediate area, heads turning to catch my words. "This isn't revenge. This is truth." I saw Vanessa flinch, and Evelyn's eyes widen in disbelief that I would dare to speak, to defy them, in front of everyone. "You wanted perfection, Mother. You wanted a pristine, unopened gift." My gaze swept from Evelyn to Vanessa, then back again. "You hid your own imperfections, your own opened gift, for years. And you did it by shaming me, by pointing to my son, by calling him defective, to deflect from your own colossal lie." A collective gasp went through the crowd. My words, delivered with a calm conviction, laid bare the breathtaking hypocrisy of their earlier attack. The guests, who had initially been a blur of shocked faces, now seemed to focus on my words, their expressions shifting from mere scandal to a dawning comprehension, a quiet fury on my behalf. I saw a few older relatives, who had always been dismissive of me, now look at me with a mixture of shock and dawning respect. The power dynamic was irrevocably shifting. "You called my son defective." I continued, my voice gaining strength, each word deliberate, precise. I wasn't shouting, but my words held the weight of years of suppressed pain, now finally unleashed. "My beautiful, brilliant, compassionate son, you used his innocent existence to mask your own monstrous deceit. While your son, David's son, was out there searching for his parents, you were too busy upholding your perfect facade and condemning me for daring to live an honest life, however messy it might be." I could feel Leo stir against me, sensing the change in my tone, the protective fury in my voice. He looked up, his wide eyes reflecting the chaos, but also, I hoped, my strength. Evelyn's face was a study in pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged again, but David, with surprising quickness, stepped directly in front of me, shielding me fully. "That's enough." Evelyn, he said, his voice cold, devoid of any warmth, you will not lay a hand on Isabel. He then turned to the assembled guests, his voice raising to command attention. Cutting through the remaining whispers, I apologize to all of you for this spectacle. But the truth, however painful, needed to come out. This wedding is off. I cannot marry a woman who has so fundamentally lied to me, nor can I join a family built on such profound deception and cruelty. The announcement landed like a bomb. The room erupted again, but this time, the shouts were louder, more explicit. The wedding is off. Oh my God. I can't believe it serves her right. Vanessa let out another keening wail, falling to her knees, her elaborate gown pooling around her like a discarded dream. My mother stood frozen, her eyes wide with a terrifying blankness, as if her entire world had just ceased to exist. Their carefully constructed lives, their public image, their very identities, were crumbling before their eyes. The consequences were immediate, profound, and utterly devastating for them. Their guests, their closest friends and family, were witnesses to their complete undoing. I looked at David, who stood firm, his gaze meeting mine. There was an unspoken apology in his eyes, and a deep gratitude. He had not only exposed their lies, but had also, inadvertently, given me my voice, my freedom. He hadn't just broken off his engagement, he had shattered the illusion that had trapped me for decades. As the commotion intensified, an event staff rushed forward, trying to restore some semblance of order. I felt a gentle tug on my hand. Leo. He looked up at me, his little brow furrowed. Mommy, are we going home now? He asked, his voice small, but laced with a hopeful innocence. His question cut through the noise, through the lingering trauma, and brought me back to the most important truth of all. Him. I knelt down, bringing myself to his eye level. I smoothed his hair back from his forehead, my thumb tracing the curve of his cheek. Yes, sweetie, I said, my voice soft, but filled with a new, vibrant strength. We're going home, and we're going to be just fine. My gaze flickered to Evelyn and Vanessa, still locked in their public meltdown. Their carefully curated lives were in ruins, their faces a testament to their own destructive choices. I felt no triumph, no glee, only a profound, liberating sense of release. The emotional collapse I had expected for myself had instead been theirs, a direct consequence of their own cruelty. My resolve, which had been building for years, had finally found its moment to solidify. This public exposure, this shattering climax, was not the end of my pain, but the definitive end of their power over me. I finally felt a true and deep sense of self-worth, unshackled from their judgment. I stood up, taking Leo's hand firmly in mine, and began to walk, slowly, deliberately, away from the wreckage of their wedding, away from the debris of a lifetime of shame, towards a future that, for the first time, felt truly my own. The Nashville night air, crisp and cool, washed over me as Leo and I stepped out of the Omni, leaving the suffocating heat of the ballroom behind. The cacophony of shattered dreams and exposed lies faded into a distant hum. Leo, still clutching my hand, looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky, his small shoulders still trembling slightly. It's quiet now. Mommy, he whispered, a hint of relief in his voice. I knelt, pulling him into a tight embrace, burying my face in his soft hair. The scent of him, of childish innocence and simple honesty, was an anchor grounding me in the reality of our shared existence, a reality far more precious than any societal facade. Yes, sweetie, I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. It's quiet now. We walked, not towards a waiting car, but just walked. The immediate aftermath was a blur of adrenaline and the profound lightness of release. I breathed deeply, tasting freedom in the humid air. The images of Vanessa crumpled on the floor. Evelyn's blank, shattered face flickered in my mind, but they were no longer sharp, agonizing stabs. They were distant, almost cinematic scenes, disconnected from my core, the emotional collapse I had anticipated for myself. The complete undoing had manifested in them instead. They had finally faced the reckoning they had so long avoided. And I, the supposed defective product, stood whole, intact, and surprisingly at peace. Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects of the Monroe wedding scandal spread like wildfire through Nashville's social circles and beyond. It was the kind of story tabloids salivated over: wealth, betrayal, a secret child, and a dramatic public unmasking. My phone, usually quiet, became a relentless source of buzzing notifications. Old acquaintances, distant relatives, even reporters tried to reach me. I ignored most of them, seeking only the quiet solace of my apartment and the comforting routine of life with Leo. However, a few calls I did take. My paternal aunt, Clara, whom I hadn't spoken to in years due to Evelyn's subtle machinations, called, her voice choked with apologies. Isabel. I had no idea, she confessed, expressing deep regret for believing the family narrative about me. Your mother, she always made you out to be so difficult. I'm so sorry. Her words, though late, were a balm, a small crack in the wall of isolation I had lived behind. The most surprising contact came from David. He called me 2 days after the wedding, his voice weary but resolute. He apologized profusely for the chaos, for dragging me into it, but thanked me, genuinely, for my courage. He explained that he had immediately connected with Thomas through the adoption agency. The meeting had been emotional, overwhelming, but filled with a profound sense of rightness. Thomas, a bright, thoughtful boy, was initially bewildered by the sudden appearance of a birth father, but David spoke of their instant connection, a natural bond that transcended years of separation. He told me that he had begun legal proceedings to establish paternity and gain custody with the support of Thomas's adoptive parents, who, though heartbroken to lose him, understood the boy's desire to know his biological father. I owe you everything. Isabel, David had said, his voice raw with emotion. You didn't just give me back my son. You opened my eyes to the truth about the woman I almost married and the family I almost joined. You saved me from a lifetime of signs. His words were a powerful affirmation, a stark contrast to the decades of being told I was a burden, a disappointment. Justice, in a quiet personal sense, was unfolding. Thomas had a father, and David had the truth. As for Evelyn and Vanessa, their world had indeed crumbled. The wedding, planned down to the last gilded detail, had cost a fortune, all of which was now gone. Non-refundable. The social fallout was immense. Stories spread like wildfire, painting them as manipulative and cruel. Many of their so-called friends, the very people who had laughed at their cruel jokes, now ostracized them. Evelyn's carefully cultivated social standing was in ruins. Vanessa's career, already built on tenuous connections, suffered a significant blow as former clients and colleagues distanced themselves from the scandal. I heard through the grapevine that their once impenetrable mother-daughter alliance had fractured under the weight of shared blame and recrimination. Their constant fighting, their desperate attempts to shift blame, only further alienated them from the few people who remained. The narrative of the perfect Monroe family had been irrevocably shattered. Life with Leo settled into a new rhythm, infused with a newfound sense of peace. The oppressive shadow of my family's judgment, which had loomed over me for so long, had finally lifted. I still worked at the publishing house, finding quiet satisfaction in my editorial role. But my evenings and weekends were entirely devoted to Leo. We visited the Nashville Zoo, explored the Warner Park Nature Center, and spent hours at the library, fostering his love for stories. I found myself laughing more freely, experiencing a lightness I hadn't known since childhood. My relationship with Leo deepened, strengthened by our shared experience and my renewed sense of self. He saw a mother who was no longer constantly worried, no longer flinching at every phone call. He saw strength, and in turn, he blossomed, his lisp slowly fading with consistent speech therapy, his confidence soaring. The growth within me was profound. I no longer yearned for my mother's approval, nor did I resent Vanessa's past perfection. The emotional abuse, once a gaping wound, had begun to scar over, leaving behind not bitterness, but a quiet resilience. I realized that my value was not, and never had been, dependent on their validation. My worth came from my integrity, my love for my son, and my quiet strength in the face of adversity. The lasting impact of that day was not just the exposure of their lies, but the liberation of my spirit. I understood now that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting despite the fear, about choosing truth over comfortable lies. I never formally reconciled with Evelyn or Vanessa. There were no grand apologies, no tearful reunions. I maintained a polite distance, a boundary I had learned, through decades of pain, was necessary for my own well-being. Occasionally, a message would come through a third party, a veiled attempt to shift blame or express bitterness, but I met them with silence. The justice I found wasn't in their suffering, but in my own freedom from it. Looking back, the wedding wasn't the culmination of their perfect life, but the dramatic, public unraveling of a lifetime of deception. For me, it was the climax of a long, arduous journey, but also the true beginning. I was Isabel Monroe, a single mother. Yes, but no longer humiliated. I was strong, capable, and finally, truly, free. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but I walked it with my head held high, my hand firmly in Leo's, knowing that we were finally, authentically, ourselves, unburdened by the weight of someone else's lies. The story wasn't over. It was just finally, truly, mine to write.